All right. So hi everyone, and welcome to the third webinar in the Solutions at Scale virtual education series. My name is Rachel, and I'm the Environmental Education Coordinator here at Reforest London. I currently work at Reforest at the Westminster Pond Centre here in London, Ontario, which is being developed as London's first centre for environment and sustainability. So really excited to have you here, to have you be a part of our virtual education series. This webinar series is focused on getting to know your green space and building up towards our virtual conference, which is happening very soon, March 26th and 27th, and that's on the topic of overcoming challenges in urban forestry. So a special thanks to Natural Resources Canada for our 2 billion trees funding, making this education series possible, and some other projects here at the Westminster Pond Centre. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm sitting and am situated on the traditional lands of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Lenape peoples, nations which have long-standing relationships with the land, water, and region of southwestern Ontario. We extend our recognition to our neighboring First Nations communities, the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, Oneida Nation of the Thames, and the Munsee Delaware Nation, who continue to steward the land today. We also recognize the treaties of this area, such as the London Township Treaty of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum, among many others. So I am super excited to welcome to our virtual stage, to our webinar today, Colleen Cirillo. If you don't already know, Colleen has spent many years in the world of nature interpretation, protection, and restoration, including 12 years at Toronto and Region Conservation and 2.5 years at Ontario Nature. From 2015 to 2020, she was Director of Education at the Toronto Botanical Garden, and since January 2022, she has worked with the David Suzuki Foundation on the Butterflyway Project and native seed-related projects. Colleen has served on many committees and boards, including those of Ontario Invasive Plant Council, NANPS, LEAF, and Project Swallowtail. She's also a longtime volunteer with a local community meal program called Dinner with Dignity. Since 2009, Colleen has chaired the Horticulture Outreach Collaborative, HOC, which brings together ecologists and horticulturalists to protect native plant diversity in Ontario. The Grow Me Instead Guide, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, is now in its 3rd edition, and it's the most popular initiative. Colleen's children accuse her of loving her garden more than them, and in her own words, sometimes the truth hurts. So welcome, Colleen. We are so excited to have you here to speak to us today, and to be, like I said, our 3rd speaker in this series. Before I hand it over to you, just a couple of housekeeping notes. I have everyone muted, so don't worry about accidentally unmuting yourself during the presentation. It shouldn't give you the option to unmute until the very end, where we'll be opening up for questions with a short Q&A. Feel free to use the chat. Please introduce yourself and where you're zooming in from. If you're coming from outside of London, we're always really interested to see. Lastly, you may have noticed that this webinar is being recorded. As attendees, your privacy is of utmost importance to us. Your names, your photos, any icons that show up will not be shared. So thank you, and I'll hand it over to you, Colleen.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I'm going to share my screen. Please let me know if it's working for you.
Yeah, I can see that just fine.
Perfect. Okay. And you asked me to do a little something here about it. Okay, I think I'm... Rachel, you asked me to do something about annotations. I'm in the more section. I didn't see that.
Yeah, if you don't see it, that's okay. I think...
Disable. Okay, I think I'm good now.
Perfect. All right, thank you. Yeah, no, I think we're all good to go then.
Great.
So over to you.
Thank you. Well, thanks for inviting me to speak today. I am at my core a gardener and a naturalist, so it's always a pleasure to talk about habitat gardening because it's a way to bring those two interests, those two sensibilities together. So that's what we will be speaking about today, about using our gardens for good. There is immense potential for gardeners and their gardens to contribute to the protection of wild species and to mitigate and adapt to climate change. So today we're going to explore plant choices, maintenance, and design, how we can get there. And I'm going to begin with some definitions. But first, I want to say this is a lovely picture taken by Leslie Bowl, who's a nature photographer, as well as many other things. And you can see wild bergamot and harebell, both native species that are in my garden. Native plants, that's a term that gets used a lot. And I apologize if some of this information is old news for some of the audience. I wasn't sure what your level of awareness is, so I will go through some definitions. I hope it's not too boring for some of you. It might be new for others. Let's start with native plants. It's a term that gets used an awful lot, and you probably would have a slightly different definition depending on who you speak to. But I use this definition. It's a plant. A native plant is a plant that has existed in an area for millennia. It's evolved with other native species of plants, animals, fungi, and bacteria in the presence of native soils and climatic conditions. Native plants play an important and foundational role in ecosystems. They provide food, shelter, nesting material for insects, birds, mammals, amphibians, and reptiles. But despite their beauty and their ecological importance, native plants remain a mystery to some people, many people, and are underrepresented in most of our nurseries and our gardens. This is a picture of a native plant garden from 2002 in Etobicoke, which is the west suburb of Toronto. And Christina's garden here, this was one of the first native plant gardens I saw in Toronto. And it was just a fantastic garden, but boy, was it in contrast to all of the large expanses of lawn all around it. So some people appreciated it, not everybody, but she did a great job of communicating her intent, which I think is really important. Now let's talk about specialization, which is what happens because species have co-evolved together. So while it's true that a non-native plant, a plant from somewhere else, can provide wildlife with shelter, nesting opportunities, and some food options, native plants support a greater diversity and number of wildlife species at all stages of their life. And that's the important thing, that we have to remember that many species, insect species especially, will have many different stages of life, 3 or 4 stages of life. And so we want to support them at all those different life stages. The significant difference between a native and a non-native plant is the ability to support these native insects that have co-evolved with plants. It really comes down to chemistry. Our plant-eating insects have evolved with native plants, so they can combat the defenses of some of those plants, because plants have chemicals in their foliage that prevents some herbivore activity. But the insects that have evolved with them can combat those defenses. So many insects, at least in their larva stage, are specialized. They feed on one plant or a small number of plants only. Over here, we see the monarch and different types of milkweed that are available for monarch caterpillars. So this is an extreme specialization example where the larva of a species can only feed on one type of plant, milkweed. Some other larvae will be specialized, but not to the same extent. They might have a small number of plants they can feed on. Non-native plants are brand new to these insects and not palatable. Our insects have evolved with the native plants, have not evolved with the non-native plants, and so they can't combat their chemical defenses to consume them and derive nourishment. And this is why one of the reasons why some non-native plants become invasive, because there are no checks and balances in place. When our gardens and our parks are filled with non-native plants, we have fewer insects and fewer birds that rely on them for food, either throughout their lifespan or for part of it. I kind of think of it this way, that when we fill our gardens and parks with non-native plants, it's a bit like serving your family with a bowl of plastic food. I would highly recommend Douglas Tallamay and Heather Holmes' books and websites. Douglas Tallamay is a professor of entomology at the University of Delaware. Heather Holmes, she is from Ontario originally. She's a bee ecologist as well as a horticulturalist, and she has an amazing website, and her books are available as well to teach us a lot about native plants and native plant gardening and specialization. Ptolemy focuses on Lepidoptera larvae, so moth and butterfly caterpillars, and woody plants, the connection between those two groups. While adult butterflies can derive nourishment from many sources, many different plants, their caterpillars are pickier. Their caterpillars are often specialists. Heather Holmes' books identify specialist pollinators, especially bees, on both soft-stemmed and woody plants, and her books provide practical advice on including these plants in our gardens. Another excellent resource for your local area is the Upper Thames and Region Conservation Authority. They have a butterfly larva host plant list on their website, thamesriver.on.ca. Just a few more definitions, and then we'll get into the meat of the talk. So non-native, naturalized, and invasive plants. What are these? If a plant is not native, it is non-native or alien or invasive. Those are terms that are sometimes used. Sorry, alien or introduced. They're not at all invasive. But sometimes those plants will become naturalized or invasive. So let's start with non-native. Non-native plants have been brought into a region by human activity, accidentally or deliberately. As the climate changes and landscapes are developed, some of these non-native plants are showing themselves to be invasive. So certain areas will have lists of invasive plants, but also of watch plants. So plants on their watch list where they're showing tendencies of invasiveness. In our area, we have the Bromians Dead Guide for Southern Ontario. I've included the website at the bottom, and that is an excellent resource for looking at non-native, naturalized, and invasive plants, and then alternatives that are safer and more contributing to ecology. A naturalized plant is a non-native species which has dispersed itself in the region, but doesn't pose a serious threat to native species by displacing, disrupting, or negatively impacting them. Collectively, though, these plants take up vast areas that were once available to native species, so they're still of concern, at least that's my opinion. An invasive plant is a non-native plant that readily disperses in the region and clearly negatively impacts native biodiversity, the economy, and/or society, including human health. Here on the slide, we see two species. One is butterfly bush, which often is considered, well, it's considered by some to be a butterfly-friendly plant. And it's true that many butterflies will go to butterfly bush for nectar. However, butterfly bush does not host any of the larvae of the butterflies, and it is on the watch list for some provinces. So they're keeping an eye on it and seeing how it spreads. And then on the other side, we have Russian olive, which is invasive. It's on the invasive list for Ontario and a few other provinces. However, when I first started working in conservation a very, very long time ago now, we were actually promoting this as a bird garden plant because some birds do consume the fruit, the little olive-like fruits there. Now we know better, a little too late, but we're always learning and then changing our suggestions for folks. Now, Ptolemy, who I mentioned earlier, he uses different terms for these plants. And I like the terms he uses because they remind us of the importance and the intended roles of plants. So his terms are detractor, non-contributor, and contributor. So a contributor would be a native plant. That means it's giving and taking in the system. A non-contributor would be like a naturalized plant, where it's there, it's not really doing any harm, but it's also not really doing any good. And a detractor would be an invasive plant, so something that is clearly detrimental to the system. Why are we adding native plants to our gardens? Well, native plants, as I mentioned, are the foundation of all our ecosystems. They make higher life possible. Only plants can turn the energy from the sun into food and make it available to other species. Maintaining a diverse native plant garden can also help with carbon and water storage. The intact soil with high amounts of root biomass will store carbon, just like forests do, not to the same extent, obviously. And a multi-layered native plant garden with deep roots also helps to filter and store stormwater. So it's a way for people to act on climate change and biodiversity loss right at home. And it really does, it's really a very hopeful thing to be a part of. And you'll find that the community is extremely supportive. Back to Talame, I'll be referring to him quite a bit. We're going to look at some species now. We're going to start with woody species, so trees and shrubs. Talame ranked trees and shrubs for their ability to support Lepidoptera species. Lepidoptera is a group of insects that includes moths and butterflies. And he found that these 5 groups of trees, so the group of tree, the other term for that is a genus, so, the plural is genuses, or there's another one, but I'll go with genuses. So he's got the 5 top genuses right there. So oak is the very top. And in that third column, you see the number of Lepidoptera species that use oak. So their caterpillars are using oak. Under oak, we have the willows and on and on. So let's talk about oak for the first little bit here. There are 11 species of oak that are native in Ontario. They tend to be very long-lived trees, resistant to wind and ice storms. And so cities that may have refrained from using oak too much because of fear of it being too slow growing or difficult to transplant are now taking a second look at oak and realizing that oak species are excellent in a time of climate change where we have some pretty intense weather conditions. Across Eastern North America, 534 species of caterpillars use oak either exclusively or mostly. Oak trees also host a number of other insects, not just Lepidoptera, plus mammals, birds, and fungi. One cool thing I like about old oaks, because they can live to 200 plus years, is that maternal bat colonies will exist sometimes under the flaky bark of old oak trees. And their acorns are highly prized food for wild turkeys, jays, and so many more species. So big old oaks are of immense ecological value. If you live in a city, you might want to consider some oaks that are really good for or really tolerant of difficult urban situations, like the bur oak, which I have in my front yard here in downtown Toronto, the swamp red or Schumann oak, and the swamp white oak. If you don't have room for an oak in your garden, that's okay, but you can ask a neighbor to put one in, which I've done because I wanted to so that I would have a good acorn production. Or you can just work on the protection of the oaks, the old oaks in your neighborhood, because they will continue to give and give and give for decades, for centuries. Let's move on to willow. So willow is second, that's the Salix genus. Second in terms of its ability to host moths and butterflies, their caterpillars, that is. Talame ranks them as second only to oaks. In our area, willows are also the larva host plant, for some common butterflies, morning cloak, viceroy, hair streaks, and dusky wings. In addition, willows are excellent for providing pollen to the early emerging bees. And there are a number of bees that are specialists with pollen. You can see that picture on the screen. That is of a pussy willow and a little, I think it's a mining bee, but I'm not exactly sure. That photo is from Heather Home, and you can find many more photos and incredible information on her website, which is Pollinators of Native Plants. And all these links will be included on a slide at the end, and I can share them with Rachel as well. So suggestions for willows if you live in the city, in and around London, definitely pussy willow is fabulous. Although willows tend to naturally show up along rivers and in wet areas, I see them doing well in gardens away from water as well. They might need some watering until they're well established. So pussy willow, Babs willow, peach-leaved, cottony, there's a large list of willows that would do well in your gardens. The Upper Thames River Conservation Authority has a great list of plants for habitat gardening, so definitely check that out. You can see I'm a big fan of Talame, and I'll mention him again, Douglas Talame. He likes to say, garden for caterpillars. And I have a little example to demonstrate this, because sometimes we environmentalists, we can use terms and nice sayings, but not really explain or demonstrate them. So this is a little example of what it means to garden for caterpillars and why it's important. On the screen here, you see a golden-crowned kinglet. This is one of our smallest birds, and some golden-crowned kinglets will remain in southern Ontario through the wintertime. Now, I know this bird to be an insectivore, and for years I wondered what on earth this bird was eating in the wintertime. And just recently, I heard from someone who's also a naturalist and a habitat garden enthusiast that they consume the caterpillars of the one-spotted variant butterfly. So that's a type of butterfly, a small butterfly, and the little caterpillar it looks like an inchworm. And that's how that species overwinters, in the caterpillar form. So, sorry, this is a moth, not a butterfly. So these little birds through the wintertime are searching for the larva of the one-spotted variant butterfly. And that is their main source of food through the winter. So even if you're not a fan of insects, if you like birds, you've got to come around to insects, because most insects consume birds. About 96% of them consume birds right at the start of their lives when they're young, and many will consume insects, at the start of their lives, and many will continue to consume insects throughout their lives. Now, Heather Holm, Talamay, and others have also rated the insect supporting abilities of our native plants, the soft-stemmed native plants. So now we're moving away from the woodies, the trees and the shrubs, and we're looking at soft-stemmed grasses and flowers. I don't have time to mention them all, but I wanted to mention the two that come out on top. So goldenrod, we're going to start with goldenrod, and then we're going to go to asters. And goldenrod does get a bad rap. And it's true that there are some species that are really aggressive, but we can use that for good, especially when we're dealing with invasive species. But I wanted to talk generally about goldenrods now. So they are ranked on as the top insect supporting native plant in our area. If you have a small garden and you want to make a big ecological impact, keep that in mind. And you can see some of the ones that are garden appropriate on the slide right now. And you can also go to a brochure that is online on the City of Toronto website called Get to Know Goldenrod. That's the name of the brochure. And it has a list of some species that work well in gardens. Now, goldenrod, this is probably old news for the folks on the call or on the webinar, but just in case, I'll mention it. Goldenrod is often blamed for hay fever. But goldenrod has dense, heavy pollen that is insect distributed, not by wind. It's ragweed that flowers at the same time and has a nondescript green flower that is the cause of hay fever. Very few people are allergic to goldenrod, but because goldenrod is showy, it's the one people see. In my garden, I have stiff goldenrod, zigzag goldenrod, and blue-stemmed goldenrod. I really love the tall, stiff goldenrod in the back of my sunny garden. And the long, tall stalks remain through the wintertime, so nice structure added to my winter garden. The other ones, the zigzag and the blue-stemmed, are shorter, and they do well in dappled shade. And one bonus of all of these goldenrod species is that they are extremely easy to start from seed. So in the fall, you can gather the seed from your garden, and then you can winter sow them, and you'll have hundreds of plants to share with your neighbors and your friends. Oh, at the side, we have a picture of a downy woodpecker digging into that goldenrod gall, looking for the larva of a fly. And so that larva, the fly would have put laid an egg on that plant earlier in the year, say the end of the fall or in the fall. And then the plant has an allergic reaction and creates this growth on the stem. But downy woodpeckers and also chickadees, they know that if they work hard and they get into the middle of that growth, they'll find a high protein snack. So that's what that little downy woodpecker is doing. And that's another reason why to leave standing stems when you can in your garden. asters. Asters are second from the top on the list, so just under goldenrods, of insect supporting native plants. I can't say enough about them for midsummer to late fall insect support. Here we have a New England aster. This is a picture from my garden. And I just love this one. It's so showy. And even though in nature, I often see it around rivers and ponds, I grow it in a garden that gets no water. And look at it. It's just gorgeous. And on the flower is a little sweat bee. Here in Toronto, where I live, the green sweat bee is the official City of Toronto bee. So you do want to choose your species carefully because some are spreaders, and stay on top of the spread if you don't have a big garden, which I don't have. Some are better behaved in my little garden than others. I have loam and sunny conditions in the front. In the front, I have this one, New England aster, but I also have sky blue aster, which is a much shorter one with a more light blue flower. And in the back where I have shade, I have the large-leaved aster. And this is one that is often recommended as an alternative to invasive ground covers for shade because the leaves act like a ground cover. They're large and they spread out quite a bit from the stem. And so they'll cover a lot of the soil. It's a nice alternative to, say, goutweed or periwinkle. So large-leaved aster is perfect for dry shade, either dense shade or dappled shade. The stem reaches 1.5 to 3 feet tall when flowering, and it's the basal leaves that act as the ground cover. Another one for dappled shade, which does well in dry conditions, is whitewood aster. Those are just some suggestions, but there are so many asters you can add to your garden, and I challenge you, once you add asters and goldenrod to your garden, to make it through your yard in any decent amount of time, late summer or early fall. The insect activity is so fascinating that you will not be able to just walk by. You will stop and watch them. And then you can take lovely pictures, even with old cell phones like I have here. I wanted to mention native evergreens quickly because, at least where I live, there aren't many. I don't know why. Maybe it's because people don't want to block their view. But native evergreens are so important for year-round wildlife support. And also, they're great for privacy and windbreaks. Now, English and Japanese yews are popular ornamentals, but Canada does have its own native yew that will work in gardens. So if you want an alternative to the English or Japanese species, look for Canada yew. Yes, it is hard to come by. Definitely visit the specialized nurseries, and there will be a list of those that I'll talk about later. This is a low-lying shrub that grows from Manitoba eastward. In my yard, at the back of my backyard, I have white cedar, eastern white cedar, and I love it for, it acts like a big hedge, gives me a bit of privacy and windbreak. It's on the northern side of my property. Plus, it is where all the activity happens in the wintertime. The chickadees, the juncos, the cardinals are all using this cluster of cedars for shelter from cold winds and also for food because there are still some seeds remaining in the cones. Over here is a picture of a beautiful cedar waxwing. We're going to talk a little bit about maintenance. So we're moving from the species section of the talk to the maintenance section. And I don't have a ton of time, but I wanted to mention some key concepts. So we'll start with the fact that insects and other species as well their needs will change throughout their life cycle. But this is especially true for insects because insects have a completely different life cycle than we do. And sometimes we forget that, or sometimes we never learned it in the first place. But it's important to keep that in mind and then to support them accordingly. It's not enough just to support the adults, which are more visible because they're often flying around. You want to consider all the stages and the different needs at each of them. It's easier to support the flying insects, but you won't have the flying adults, that is. You won't have the flying adults if you don't take care of the larvae, the eggs, and so on. Again, as Talame says, you want a garden for caterpillars. Here we see a stem nesting bee doing its thing. So that's on the left side of the screen. At the top, you see a little bird's nest. And I don't know if you can see it, but there's all sorts of interesting things being used to create that nest. And that is typically the case. Birds are incredibly resourceful. I have found snakeskin in nests. I have found feathers of other species, fur, bits of litter, unfortunately, birch bark, leaves, on and on, pine needles. So you want to leave all these bits that can be used to create homes. It's not waste. It's not yard waste. It's the components of homes. And then at the bottom, what looks like a paper bag hanging on a branch is actually the cocoon of a cecropia moth that I found in the wintertime at my in-laws' cottage. So these are all just examples of how insects survive winter, how insects nest, and not just insects, but birds as well. So we want to keep in mind the different needs of wildlife at different seasons and different stages of life. Oh, sorry, going back to this for a second. There's a picture of the stem nesting bee. About 30% of our native bees are stem nesting, and about 70% are soil or ground nesting bees. So that's something to keep in mind. And Pollinator Partnership Canada has all sorts of amazing resources to support pollinators in your home garden. Leave the leaves is something we hear over and over again, and there are some really nice graphics to show why that matters. I like this one because it shows the Luna moth. And so if you like Luna moths, you want to keep your leaves because of their cocoons that are kept in the leaves. So a habitat garden is not just about plant selection, it's all about maintenance, and it's about maintenance and design as well. So that's what we're considering right now is maintenance. So you want to maintain some natural debris, we're not just talking about leaves, but also the dead stems that the bees are going to use, the dry, like all sorts of stuff, even if you can, snags, which are dead trees that are still standing, that are basically like, can become condos for birds. So yeah, and it's not an all or nothing thing. Like sometimes we can be a little bit on the judgy side as environmentalists, and sometimes we can be off-putting even though we don't mean to be. So when we say leave the leaves, you don't have to save every leaf that falls on your car, on your driveway, on your sidewalk. Clearly you're going to remove some of your leaves, but I like to say to keep as many leaves and as much natural debris as you can for as long as you can. Now people want a hard and fast rule sometimes, like what temperature should it be? How late in the season can we go before we clean up the garden? Actually, you don't want to clean up the garden. As much as you can, don't clean up the garden. And going back to those stem nesting bees, they're going to nest, the stems that are up right now can be used by bees come spring or summer, female bees looking to nest. So you don't want to cut those stems up back at all. The old stems you want to leave up for more than a full year. And then if you leave seed heads, that's a great way to feed birds. It's a very cheap and lazy way to do things, which I like. It's also following nature's lead. As much as I can, I try to do that, follow nature's lead, and I focus on habitat over homes and habitat over feeders. A few years ago, I was reading about some research into the fertility of overwintering birds in cities, and that research showed that there was a greater success, or like success of in terms of number of offspring, in areas with abundant standing stems and dead seed heads. So again, it's an alternative way to feed the birds, to provide the habitat, and let nature do its thing as much as you can in your city. So let's drive home the fact or the message of that messy is habitat and that it's important to leave the leaves. Here are some species that are overwintering. And in fact, most species overwinter. The monarch gets so much attention, and rightly so. It is a fascinating species with a fascinating migration story, but very few insects migrate. Monarchs, red admirals, painted ladies, they migrate, but most are somehow managing to overwinter. So let's look at these three species. The top row, we see the morning cloak butterfly. This species overwinters as the adult. So you see that flying adult on the top left side. Sometimes you see morning cloak when there's still snow on the ground in March and April. If it's a really sunny day, the adults will come out and enjoy the day and maybe even look for some tree sap to nourish themselves, and then tuck themselves back into flaky bark until spring is properly in place. In the middle row, we see the woolly bear caterpillar, and beside it, the picture of the moth it becomes, which is referred to as the Isabella tiger moth. This species overwinters as the larva. And again, you can sometimes see the overwintering form in the wintertime. I have seen this caterpillar on snow on a sunny winter day, and you might have seen that as well. So that's pretty cool that they somehow managed to survive our cold winters, and then the adults will be active in the summertime. And then at the bottom, we have the Polyphemus moth, which overwinters in the cocoon state. And that's what you see on the bottom left. An interesting fact about this moth and about a few other moths is that they are born without any mouth parts. They do not feed at all. They live just a few days, only to mate. The females lay their eggs, and then that is the end of their adult life. It is most common for moths and butterflies to overwinter as larvae, so that second row there. That's the more common strategy among insects overwintering. Let's talk about design. Actually, let me go back to maintenance for a minute and just mention a few other things. A few other things to keep in mind and to do if you can. Obviously, to forego chemical pesticides and fertilizers, which can kill insects and birds outright, injure them, or reduce their ability to navigate or to find food. And ditch the leaf blower, because leaf blowers desiccate insects and destroy their habitat. It's easy for me to say I have a small property. If you have a large property, you're going to do what makes sense for you. But just know that they are quite damaging to insects directly and indirectly. If you use mulch, limit your mulch. That is because mulch, especially if applied heavily, will make that soil, that ground, inhospitable to our ground nesting bees. And remember, about 70% of our native bee species are ground nesting. So instead, why not use the leaf litter that falls as your mulch? Because leaf litter is much lighter, and that will allow the ground to still be accessible for bees. Invasive species are just becoming more and more of a problem. Invasive plants, if you can manage them in your garden, please do. And there are some great resources online. I would encourage you to visit the Invasive Species Center website, which is invasivespeciescenter.ca. Now let's get on to design. So we'll start with floral resources. So floral resources, those are the things that draw the insects towards the flowers. So insects come to flowers for pollen and or nectar. And we're going to look at how design can really impact your habitat garden, make it more valuable to wildlife. Regarding flowers, you want to aim for a succession of blooms so that pollen and nectar are available from spring through summer to fall for flower visiting insects. A simple rule for beginners, which is promoted by Pollinator Partnership Canada, is 3 by 3. So 3 different types of flowers flowering through all 3 growing seasons. So spring, summer, and fall. So you want at least 9 different types of flowering plants, 9 different types of wildflowers. And to increase the diversity of pollinators you support, you want to have a diversity of flower types. So you want some with a more composite structure, you want some with a more tubular structure, and on and on. And you can see some great resources at the Upper Thames River Conservation Authority's website, and also Pollinator Partnership Canada. Remember too that pollen is available early on in the season from trees and shrubs. I work for the David Suzuki Foundation. A lot of my time is spent on the Butterflyway Garden, and people are always so excited about herbaceous plants, and you can see why. They're absolutely beautiful. But early in the year, when early emerging bees are coming and looking for pollen, they're going to our trees and especially our shrubs looking for that pollen. That's when the willows are really important. And also serviceberry is a wonderful early flowering shrub that provides pollen. Red maple. So don't forget about your trees and your shrubs when you're trying to support pollinators. Soft landings is a concept that's, I think, created and promoted by Talaman Homes, back to those two. So soft landings, what that means is it's a diverse group of plants, and native plants for the most part, under our trees. We call them keystone trees. These are the trees that are doing the heavy lifting in terms of supporting our Lepidoptera. So the oaks, the willows, the cherry trees, wild cherry, those types of trees, but you can put them under any native trees. It's just literally, it's so that when those insects drop onto the ground for overwinter, they have a soft, protected place. They're not going to be mowed. They're not going to be stepped on because they land in this collection of native plants and also natural debris. Because we know that that's what moths, butterflies, and bumblebees, fireflies, lacewings, and beetles do. They will come to the ground and overwinter there. So this is how we can support them. Soft landings, just I think a lovely, easy to understand concept for us habitat gardeners. I've spoken mostly about insects, but let's talk about birds for a little bit. Birds are sometimes placed into these groupings or categories based on what they eat and where they eat. Some species of birds will consume insects, seeds, and fruit in the upper canopy, so high up in trees, and others more in the middle, others lower down, say in the shrub layer, and still others on or near the ground. In addition, there are aerial insectivores, which are the birds like the swallows that are catching insects as they fly around. Pretty amazing. And then there are the bark insectivores, which are woodpeckers. So nature is pretty amazing in that it has all these different niches, and we cannot, as habitat gardeners, create all those niches, but we can certainly bring back or create some of them. And we can do that by incorporating a diversity of native plants at different heights and different ages. Birds and insects also make their homes at different levels or heights within a system. A great resource for folks that are interested in learning more about bird foraging guilds is the Credit Valley Conservation's brochure or booklet called Native Plants for Breeding Birds. This is available from their website. So that's the Credit Valley Conservation Authority. Another design consideration is light. Light, it may not be thought of much by people in terms of its impact on wildlife, but its impact on wildlife is quite substantial. We know that it can attract birds, it can disorient birds. We have the problem of bird strikes a lot in my city. But speaking of insects, we know that darkness is part of their habitat. Some things you can suggest or do yourself. I am very concerned about light. I have wonderful neighbors, but unfortunately they're very concerned about security and they have a lot of light around their homes. So I still have some work to do in my neighborhood, but some tips and some suggestions to pass on. Obviously you want to minimize the lights overall. You want to aim your lights downwards. You can change your lights from white to yellow bulbs so they're less of a detrimental impact on insects. You can use motion sensors. You can obviously turn off the lights while you're not using them. And then I take it to another level because I can be intense at times and my house is very dark inside. And then also I try to close the blinds and the drapes when I can. It's not because I'm really concerned about privacy, although that is an issue too, but more I just want to keep my indoor light inside because I know that light can have a negative impact on insects and birds. Like I said, it can cause outright damage if they smack into windows, but it can also disorient and even affect the coming together of insects for mating when it's that season for them. So light is definitely an issue. An excellent website for how to make more bird-friendly buildings or how to make sure that your buildings are safe for birds is FLAP.org, Fatal Light Awareness Program.org. And I have the website on a slide coming up. Here it is, right there. So that's a picture of my in-laws' cottage. I put this very inexpensive, easy to apply collection of dots on the window. I think I spent about $30 on this application, and it completely stopped bird strikes. Before we had these dots on the windows, I would come to this cottage with my children and we would weep because there were birds that kept hitting that window, because you can see past that window another window. And so birds, they can't comprehend of glass. A lot of research has taken place right in London, which is fantastic, at Western, onto about bird strikes and how to prevent them. And 2 inches by 2 inches is what you want for the markings on the window. Go to the website, the FLAP website, you'll find all you need to know. And I'm mentioning this because we're doing all this work to attract wildlife to our gardens. The buildings that are in or near those gardens also, we might need to also address the issues there. So we don't want to bring birds in only to have them strike our windows. Another picture on the screen is a picture of one of our rangers' signs. So many habitat gardeners, to help communicate what they're doing and to help communicate intent, they put up these signs, and they're not at all judgmental. They tend to be extremely welcoming and just explaining what they're up to and providing or offering assistance for those that also want to reconsider what a garden is, reconsider how to garden now that we are in this very difficult time of climate change and habitat destruction. I know I've covered a lot of ground, so here are some key takeaways, if you like. And the top one is really the one that it may sound trite, but it's really the one that matters the most. As an example, in nature, there is no waste. So as much as I can, I try to keep that in mind, and I limit what I take out of my garden. I cut up branches whenever I can, as opposed to removing them, leave the leaves, all that kind of thing. There is no waste in nature. I also have a composter, so some of the leaves that I can't keep on the ground, the ones that land on my porch or on my pathways, I keep and I use in my compost. Just to keep this, to end this, I'm going to leave it there. But 2 other things I'll say is 2 other mantras that I keep in mind are messy is habitat and habitat over homes or feeders, because with habitat, you get everything. You don't just get food. Bird feeders often provide just seed, right? Not insects, but we know that so many birds require insects. Being in London, you're very lucky. You have some incredible specialized native plant nurseries. You have organizations that help folks that want to do the right thing in their gardens and beyond. Where to find native plants? Caroline in Canada has an expo every year, Grow Wild. I spoke to them recently because we worked together on another project, and it's in May, as it is every year. I'm sorry, I don't have the exact date up there. They also have seed kits available, native seed kits. You can order those now. And then in the fall, they will once again have a pawpaw parade, and pawpaw is an incredibly interesting native tree. Ontario Native Plants is a really cool native plant nursery that does mail order, which is different, right? And until they came around, I wasn't aware of any specialized native plant nursery mailing plants. And I was quite skeptical about the whole thing, but everyone I know who's received an order from them has been very happy with the state of the plants. Various Loblaws do carry native plants, and you can go to the World Wildlife Fund Canada website later in the spring to find out if there are any in your area. There are full lists of native plant nurseries, specialized native plant nurseries, on the Carolinian Canada website and also the Thames River Conservation Authority website. Seeds. Some of our native plants, many of them are so easy to grow from seed, and it's just another way to deepen your relationship with these species. We have a program we call Seed Sitters. It's just a cutesy name for winter sowing, but it's a wonderful community of grassroots seed collectors and growers that is happening here in Southern Ontario. So there are some links for you. And some other amazing gardening resources. You're probably aware of these, but those are some of my favorite. Really quickly, I want to just tell a story about the pictures on the right. I have friends that work for a conservation authority, not in your area, closer to mine, and they bought a run-of-the-mill suburban home. This was maybe 15 years ago now. It was a brand new home. They were the first owners. They right away put in some native trees and shrubs, and the area all around them was just a big expanse of lawn. This little tiny saw-whet owl one day arrived. It was the fall, as you can see by the color of the leaves there, arrived in their house and remained in their garden for the day into the night. The next morning it was gone. But you can see that in some cases, it really is the case that you put in the native plants and the wildlife comes, often because there really isn't that much habitat for them. So if you're stewarding habitat, you will be rewarded with the most incredibly diverse visitors. So I would definitely encourage it. All right, so this is the last slide of my presentation. Thank you for your patience. And I just want you to look at those beautiful pictures, and I'm going to read something to you. Imagine visiting your favorite natural area where the sights and sounds, the anticipation, and the mysteries of nature bring you a kind of joy and connection that's hard to put into words. Now imagine not having to drive there, not having to fight traffic, not polluting, not wasting time, not spending money on gas or an entrance fee. You can go to this place anytime you want. See native species at all stages of life. Become familiar with them as you do the other members of your community. Get your regular dose of vitamin N for physical and emotional well-being. This is possible when you reconsider your garden, when you invite native plants into your space and follow nature's lead with maintenance and design. It can be a lot of work, it can feel daunting, but the rewards are well worth the effort. The sights and the sounds of nature, but even more important, the hope and the community you will gain. Restoring native biodiversity and ecosystems right at home in our gardens, schoolyards, and parks is not only nature's best hope, but it is our best hope. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Thanks, Colleen. That was a really powerful presentation. I love the images that you brought in as well. I think it's definitely has me a little excited as we move into the spring. There we go, move into the spring and yeah, really get to work on building these gardens or like like you've advised, leaving those elements in for our native species. So I appreciate being here. I think we're going to move into our Q&A now. I have a couple questions in the chat already. Some of them are about the resources. So people looking for the names of the authors you mentioned. Where am I here? Yeah, so some of the resources, if you want to share those with me and I can send them out to our participants after, or if you want to pop some of those in the chat specifically, I think, I'm not sure who specifically we were looking for on that name, but I think you did mention as we went through the presentation more of the authors.
Yeah.
So
I can definitely send a list to you, Rachel, and then I'll just pop a couple of the book names in the chat while we're continuing.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, there was another question about where to get some of those posters about turning off the lights. I think that's something that a lot of people don't think about or don't consider. So definitely some signage around that, and the ability to share that with our neighbors is really huge. So again, if you can just include that in the list of resources, that would be amazing. There's a question about any other suggestions for native species that might compete with goutweed, both sunny and shady spots.
This is the book you want. So the Grow Me Instead, and I have in my garden wild ginger, which is also a fabulous ground cover for shade. And then more in dappled shade, I have wild geranium, which works well. Anemone is good, except it tends to kind of flop later in the year. But this book, Grow Me Instead, for Southern Ontario, is free off of the Ontario Invasive Plant Council website. And there's a section on ground covers. So we'll list the non-native and invasive ground covers, and then it will list alternatives that are non-invasive. Most of them, not all of them, are also native. And you guys are lucky in London to have quite a few specialized native plant nurseries where you can find these excellent ground covers.
Definitely. Yeah, thank you. And I think that is such a great resource, especially when you don't know where to maybe make that first step in replacing something that that plays a role in your current garden, but could play an even bigger role for those species. So I think that's great. I have another question. Maybe if you can touch on this. Ontario Invasive Species Council has identified Acer negundo, so the box elder or Manitoba maple, as invasive. How do they justify that? Do they consider medicine plants of the indigenous peoples when making these decisions?
Mhm.
And why have I not seen a Muir maple listed as invasive? Is that something you
Yeah,
can touch
good
on at
question.
all?
The Manitoba maple actually is being reconsidered, but it's funny, there's a lot of contention around certain species, and um, it's shifted its range. It's not, it was always a North American species. So I think there are definitely connections, both to culture and to fauna, wildlife. And so just yesterday I was reading something about this. So, and I, having spent a lot of time working for conservation authorities and spent a lot of time outside, I do see that as a species that produces a lot of seed that birds consume. So I've always kind of judged it a little bit more softly. I don't consider it at the level of like a Norway maple, or even, as this person mentioned, the Amur maple, AMUR, which I do see as invasive. I think if it was always a North American plant, it will tend to have some ecological connections and some cultural connections that we want to keep in mind. But I'm no expert on these things. I can tell you that there is a lot of discussion between ecologists and horticulturalists about invasive species lists. It's very contentious. I always just focus on the connections between the plants and the insects, and how much a plant will contribute, like what Talame has done with using different terms that hopefully are less inflammatory, and get to the just to constantly remind people that plants are here to transfer energy. And also the cultural piece, which I am still quite ignorant of, but I love to learn about, is the cultural piece. So learning about native plants, it just makes you love them even more when you realize just how many of them have cultural value.
Mm.
I'm going on and on. I don't have a clear answer for that question, sorry.
No, no, that's okay. I think that's a great start, definitely. Um, and I have a couple more questions. I know we're getting close to three, so maybe we'll cap it here after these three. So this one's about greenhouses, that they're becoming very invasive light sources in southwestern Ontario. Leamington has created bylaws to mitigate this. Do you know of any action elsewhere across Ontario?
I'm sorry, I don't. This is where I am like way too myopic in my urban
Mm,
perspective. I don't, but greenhouses are interesting because local food, you want to support local food, but greenhouses, obviously they have the energy issue, they have the light issue, and they also have the fact that greenhouses will bring in insect pollinators. And now we have eastern bumblebees in British Columbia, which we've never had before, because eastern bumblebees are being used in greenhouses far
mm.
away from their native range. So they're not, it's not ideal greenhouses, but are they better than bringing in? I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't have an answer to the greenhouses question.
All good. Yeah, thank you though. Next question is if an English walnut tree gets some tent caterpillars, is it better to leave them? What would you recommend? And there was a response from someone else that says you can leave them, they won't hurt the tree, they will feed some birds. Do you have anything to add to that or thoughts on that?
No, not really. It's easy for me to say because I've only once had that happen in my yard here, and I did let them go. And the next year, it wasn't an issue. My
Mm,
in-laws' cottage, my father-in-law, when he was around, he used to feel anytime there was an infestation of an insect that he immediately needed to act. And no matter how many times we tried to tell him that these things are cyclical, and if it's not, it's not killing the plant, leave it. He did not do
mm,
that. So I don't know, sometimes it's just getting out of your own old ways of doing things or old ways of thinking. If you're, yeah, I would say it's safe to leave them, but it's up to you if you can handle the aesthetic impact. They are cyclical, so like in future years, you will have smaller populations, and then you might have a large population again in a few
mm.
years.
Good to know. Yeah, thank you. So I think that's most of our questions. If I don't think I've missed anybody. What about buckthorn? This is ruining Killaley Woods, which is an ESA here in London. Do you have any recommendations or anything to touch on with buckthorn?
Buckthorn is a huge problem all across Southern Ontario and beyond. And here in Toronto, they are trying two different things in High Park, which is close to me. It's a large area that people think is a natural park, but for those that can identify plants, we go in there and it's heartbreaking because it is almost all like anything beyond the beautiful black oaks. There's so many invasive plants, but they're trying two different things for buckthorn, including so one is like they cut it and then they put a herbicide, which not, a lot of people have strong feelings about, but they cut it and then they paint a herbicide on the stump. But then there's another type of controller they're using that is apparently less toxic and more specific to buckthorn. And I think there is information on it on the City of Toronto website. It's so hard because buckthorn thickets, and if you have a large area of buckthorn, it's really hard to manage or to deal with that. There's also some cool research happening in the States about when you remove buckthorn to overplant with species, native species that are fast growing, that grow in the same kind of conditions. And so elderberry has shown to be very good at stopping or at least reducing the amount of reseeding, like new seedlings coming up of buckthorn once you've removed the existing plants. So it's often a faceted approach and multi-year approach and forever monitoring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. Definitely something that us at Reforest we're looking at as well, trying to, control the buckthorn on site. We're, trying to look for those solutions. What is the best way to deal with it? And I think as is the consensus in the chat, like we know that it's a huge issue here in the City of London, as in a lot of places in Ontario. So I want to thank you. There's a couple more discussions going on in the chat. I think it's important to mention that Reforest, along with other nonprofits, thank you, Marianne, for bringing that up. We're running a native plant sale this year, as we do every year, where those who are interested will have the option to get some of those plants that we spoke about today, particularly the goldenrod and the asters, to incorporate into our gardens. This weekend is also Seedy Saturday in London, so people who are looking to seed share and to get some seeds for their gardens this coming year. That's a pretty huge event if you're interested to be a part of. So there's information on that on our website. You can search up Seedy Saturday. It's really easy to find. Yeah, again, a pretty big event. But yeah, I just want to thank you, Colleen, again, and Earthfest. All of the events are coming up as well. Earthfest is happening in London on April 20th, pretty close to Earth Day. So another huge event across the city where a lot of these topics will come up and where we'll have the chance to meet and discuss further. So thank you again. We do have one more webinar running next week with Ben Porchuk on benefits of trees and improving our urban ecology. So that is the last webinar in our virtual education series before the conference, but there will be more coming afterwards. I think that brings this webinar to a close. Again, 2 Billion Trees. Thanks to them for sponsoring these webinars and for allowing us to host people from all across Southwestern Ontario, like you, Colleen, who are doing the important work in educating and building community, making native plant gardening happen where we most need it. So I really appreciate it, and thank you to everyone who attended today. And we hope to see you next week, or the week after next is when our next webinar is happening. So we hope to see you then. All right, thanks so much. Bye, everyone.